Camera. Oh, okay, cool. It's recording.
Yeah, and so I feel like people should start pouring in shortly. Well, we already got people joining. There we go.
Oh, fantastic.
It's great. All right, welcome, folks. We'll be starting in, well, actually, we should probably start like immediately, but
oh, okay.
yeah. So I mean, I'll just do a little intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome. People still coming in. My name is Ben Batorsky, so I'll be helping moderate this session. If you have any technical issues, have issues hearing things or whatever, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll see if I can help you out. We'll have this talk and then we'll have that followed by Q&A. So you can put Q&A in the chat. You can see the little chat bubble at the bottom of the screen. Click on that. You can put in chat. Or if you want to ask your question, you can raise hand and I can try and unmute you and let you ask the question yourself. Please keep the questions sort of family friendly, and we're not going to be tolerating any kind of abusive behavior here. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So today we got Derek, and he's from the Hellenistic Age podcast. And yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to you, Derek.
Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. This is a first-time face reveal for a lot of you who probably maybe listen to my show, but as already been said, my name is Derek. I'm the host of the Hellenistic Age podcast, a show dedicated to the period between Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. For simplicity's sake, the term Hellenistic roughly means Greek-like. That's a modern term, by the way, and refers to specifically the peoples and kingdoms that were established in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests in parts of Central Asia, the Near East, and North Africa and Egypt. But today we'll be focusing on what is probably my favorite topic relating to the period. This is referring to across the Indus, encounters between the Greek and Indian worlds, when Greco-Indian contact had gone from virtually non-existent to achieving a level that had been unmatched until the modern period. So we're going to focus on a few key moments and snapshots. Unfortunately, this period is not really well documented, so let's kind of start from the beginning. The Greeks were aware of India since, or at least the 5th century BC. Gods like Dionysus and Heracles were associated with the Far East, either as civilizers or conquerors, mixtures of two. But there was also the destination for semi-legendary conquerors like Semiramis of Assyria and Cyrus the Great of Persia. Actually, pardon me, I'm going to put my laser pointer on here so I can direct. Beautiful. So by the late 5th century BC, we have a written historical tradition that arises from Greek authors like Herodotus, Hecataeus, or Ctesias, which gives us an idea of the Greek knowledge of India. Descriptions of India tend to be somewhat off, to put it mildly. They're usually passed down from second or third-hand sources from the Persian Empire, which had expanded from Asia Minor until Pakistan. Indian society is described variously as some sort of primitive utopia. Think of your noble savage archetypes, but applied to a large scale, where the Indians had little in means, but wanted little. But we know that at this time, India was very complex in terms of societies. So we also have the garbled transmissions of bizarre creatures and specimens, such as the dog-headed people, as we see here, Cyclops, and the one large foot people. I don't know the exact name, but we can assume that we're not sure where this information comes from, but it's somewhat consistent in how unusual it is. Now, this also can't forget about the gold-digging ants, which may or may not be some sort of marmot. This changes by the mid to late 4th century BC. By 334, Alexander the Great in the Kingdom of Macedonia in northern Greece launches an invasion of the Persian Empire, which eventually brings Greek troops to Central Asia and India for the first time, and certainly not the last. Alexander and his army, after a brutal campaign in modern Afghanistan, leads them south across the Hindu Kush Mountains, where he then battles against local rulers in the Punjab over the next 2 years. After a mutiny at the river Hyphasis, Alexander and his army head down the Indus to return back to Babylon, where he dies in June of 323. The empire is then promptly torn apart by his successors. These are his generals and friends who came after him, who battled it out for the next 40 years to claim these territories as their own. This sees the establishment of three major dynasties. You have the Antigonids in Macedonia and Greece, the Ptolemies ruling over much of Egypt, and the Seleucids, who ruled over parts of Asia Minor, the Middle East, or pardon me, excuse me, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia and parts of Southwest or Northwestern India, or Pakistan more specifically. Well, when all this fighting was going on, what had happened in the Macedonian provinces in the east? Alexander had set up these territories with governors, both drawn from his own Greek officials and also local rulers. Unfortunately, many of the Greeks had been drawn back to the west to fight it out with the successors, were either killed by unhappy locals or disgruntled colonists settled by Alexander, or they just disappear from the record entirely. But shortly after Alexander left India, we have a figure known as Chandragupta Maurya, Sandrakatis to the Greeks. He comes to power and eventually establishes the beginnings of his empire in the region of the Ganges. Eventually, he expands to encompass much of the Indian subcontinent. This expansion would ultimately lead to a clash with another ambitious figure, Seleucus I Nicator, the founder of the eponymous Seleucid dynasty. Seleucus had been on a conquest of the eastern provinces to try to reintegrate them into his empire after they had been lost during the fighting. And eventually a war broke out between both dynasties in about 305 till 303. We don't really know much what happened. The entire conflict can be summed up in maybe one or two sentences from a historical source, but we do know that in 303, a treaty was signed between the two. Seleucus received about 500 war elephants from Chandragupta, and in return, Seleucus handed over his easternmost provinces, or satrapies as they are known. This would inaugurate a century of amicable relations between the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Mauryan Empire, which we will talk about in the next slide. In the aftermath of Alexander's conquests, there were several written works by Greek authors on India, supplemented by the observations of various generals and officials from Alexander's time. But the most important of these was a man known as Megasthenes. We know little about the man, but he was likely an official of Seleucus I, who journeyed to the court of Chandragupta in the city of Pataliputra, modern Patna along the Ganges River. He wrote an account of his observations known as the Indica, which has not survived, but has been extensively paraphrased and quoted by later Greco-Roman authors. These observations range from description of India's flora and fauna to the workings of the Mauryan state and Indian society. For example, we see in this brief passage how Strabo, paraphrasing Megasthenes, describes the capital city of Pataliputra as being almost a parallelogram of sorts, and describes specifically here that he had journeyed to meet Sandrakatis. Now, we aren't sure why Megasthenes wrote his Indica. It could have been a scientific curiosity, or it could have been an assessment of the military capabilities of the Mauryan state, should the Seleucids decide to invade India again, or it could have been justification as to why Seleucus withdrew from India following the war. When we compare it to earlier Greek works in India, like Herodotus or Ctesias, the Indica is leagues ahead in terms of its accuracy. Analysis of his writings suggests that he was giving an eyewitness description of the things he personally saw, and it remains the only contemporary account of Mauryan India to survive in some capacity. There have been cross-examinations done with another Indian political work known as the Arthashastra, which was supposedly written by an advisor of Chandragupta named Kautilya or Chanakya. Though the exact authorship and the dating of it is questionable, we may be coming out several centuries afterwards, but it's a valuable cross-examination nevertheless. Overall, the Indica is about as good as we can ask for from a Greek author, but his interpretation is still resembling other earlier Greek accounts. Like with Herodotus's book on Egypt, Megasthenes states that Indian society is divided into 7 different groupings, which may or may not be an early attempt to describe a caste system of sorts. He also gives an idealistic description of law and order. He gives one citation in the camp of Chandragupta, where allegedly 400,000 soldiers were gathered. There was no such thing as theft, which is highly doubtful. But how much we can say is a result of paraphrasing by later authors like Strabo or Pliny, or whether they are his own observations, we can't really say for certain. Still, the Indica was the most reliable European account of India until the Middle Ages. Following Megasthenes and Chandragupta, we have bits and pieces indicating that there were diplomatic missions sent between India and the Hellenistic kingdoms. But it's not until the middle of the 3rd century that we actually get our first Indian perspective. The most famous of these Mauryan emperors was Ashoka, later known as Ashoka the Great. In contrast to his father Bindusara and his grandfather Chandragupta, Ashoka is not recorded in the sources by the Greeks, but he is far the most well-documented ruler of his dynasty, at least in terms of Indian sources. After experiencing a religious epiphany following the violent conquest of the Kalinga peoples along the western Bay of Bengal, he became an ardent patron of Buddhism. He ordered the placement of several edicts around his empire, which stretches far south here, east, and then northwest. Most of these edicts inscriptions were recounting his life story and espousing his philosophical beliefs. He also provides us the first fascinating pieces of evidence of Greeks from an Indian author. In the Kandahar district of modern Afghanistan, the westernmost edges of the Mauryan Empire, a large carving was set up on the orders of Ashoka. It is a bilingual inscription with one version written in Greek and the other one written in Aramaic. The Greek translation reads as follows, or at least part of it, quote, 10 years having been completed, King Piodases made piety known to men, and afterwards more pious he caused men to be, and all things to flourish throughout the whole land. To summarize, this monument is communicating a Buddhist philosophy to a non-Indian audience, which what I don't include here, but also includes the prohibition of the eating of animals. But why would it be written in Greek, though? For those that remember, Seleucus ceded the region of Arachosia. This was part of the territory given over to Chandragupta as part of the Treaty of the Indus. And Arachosia was, this is also, parts of Pakistan and modern Afghanistan. The monument was actually placed near the city of Old Kandahar, a flourishing metropolis at this time. The region also saw the settlement of Greco-Macedonian colonists by Alexander, and the city of Old Kandahar was probably renamed by him as Alexandria in Arachosia, one of the many Alexandrias of the area of Asia and North Africa. The population of Greeks living under Mauryan rule must have been significant enough to warrant its inclusion alongside that of Aramaic, which was a lingua franca carried over by the Persian Empire and much spoken for much of the Iranian plateau. It appears that whomever translated Ashoka's edict into Greek also possessed a strong grasp of the Greek language. The translation is not exactly perfect, though. It's not a one-to-one match. For example, the word piety, which was in Greek, eusebia, is intended to be equivalent to the Indian term dharma or dhamma, universal truth. But eusebia carries more religious connotations regarding things like sacrificing and paying adherence to the gods. If animal sacrifices is actually contrary to Ashoka's message and also the nature of what universal truth stands for. The Aramaic is actually a little bit closer, translating it as kashit, or the truth, which is very in line with Zoroastrian philosophy. Still, it's a fantastic attempt and is a fascinating example of the interaction between Greeks and their Indian overlords ruling over this area. The Kandahar inscription was intended for those dwelling within the empire, but Ashoka's missionary work was not just limited to those within his borders, as we can see from Major Rock Edict 13. Here, Ashoka describes how he sent envoys to spread his philosophy into the ends of the earth in the kingdom of the Yonas, or the Indian word for Greek, drawing from the term Ionian. Reads as follows, quote, "And this conquest has been won repeatedly by Devanampriya, both here and among all his borderers, even as far as at the distance of 600 yohanas, where the Yona king named Antioga is ruling, and beyond this Antioga, where 4 kings are ruling, the king named Tulamaya, the king named Antakina, the king named Maka, and the king named Aliakshudala." As I mentioned before, there are no Greek sources that mention Ashoka in any capacity, nor do they mention the arrival of religious delegations or missionaries of sorts. But this isn't to say that this never happened. Are we able to identify who these 5 kings of the West were? Well, it turns out we can. Antiochus is Antiochus the first or second of Syria, or the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemy the second of Philadelphus of Egypt, Antigonus the second of Macedonia, Magas of Cyrene, and Alexander the second of Epirus. It suggests that this is an incredibly detailed or remarkably accurate understanding of the political situation of the Mediterranean world during the mid-3rd century BC. And despite this lack of any Greek testimony, it does suggest that the agents of Ashoka were operating rather deeply in these regions. While we can only imagine how these Buddhist teachings were received by the peoples of the Mediterranean, this is not the last time we see an interaction between Buddhism and Hellenism. Following the reign of Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire went to a state of decline throughout the rest of the 3rd century. By 185, the last Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, was murdered, and India once again fell from a unified empire into a series of competing dynasties and subkingdoms. This was not lost to their Western neighbors. During the contraction of the Mauryan Empire, the Greek kings who ruled over the lands of Bactria, which is approximately modern Afghanistan, had grown in power in Central Asia following their secession from the Seleucid Empire. At around the same time as Brihadratha's death in 185, the Greco-Bactrian king Demetrius I and his successors crossed the Hindu Kush and led a conquest of the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers, in what is now parts of modern Pakistan and northwestern India. Here, the Greeks would rule for the next 200 years, the so-called Indo-Greek kingdoms, even as Bactria itself was conquered by invading nomadic tribes and by the steppe peoples. Greeks and Indians were now living side by side, and scholars have debated endlessly on what role cultural exchange took place in these Indo-Greek kingdoms. Unfortunately, the knowledge about this area is extremely poor, but we do have a few snapshots. Questions like, was there a large-scale spread of Greek culture into India like there was in Egypt or Mesopotamia? Or did the minority Greeks become Indianized and were quickly absorbed into the cultural landscape? Let's look at some curious examples. Following the conquest of the Indo-Greeks, we see that they had to come to terms with the local peoples that they now ruled over. This is most reflected prominently by their coins. For most of the Hellenistic world, coins are almost universally a Greek, or rather, or overwhelmingly Greek in terms of their audience, imagery, and their language. In India, we see that Greeks were minting coins that, while retaining several Hellenic elements, were nevertheless adhering to Indian customs. Whereas those of Bactria were exclusively using the Greek language on their inscriptions, local languages and alphabets like Kharosthi or Brahmi were occupying these same spaces on the Indo-Greek coins. And rather than just simply a traditional circular model, square types were also being produced. These can contain imagery that is more in line with concepts of Indian kingship, like the spoked wheel or the lotus. And even Indian deities make an appearance, like Vasudeva Krishna. When we look at these examples here, as I'm pointing over here, these are all minted by the same ruler, Agathocles, who was either contemporary or very short after Demetrius. We see that he was issuing coin types that were both traditionally Greek and Indian models, and also a mixture of both. The coin on the left here is an example we see very standard of a Hellenistic coin, though fantastic specimen. The inscription Basileos Agathokleos in Greek, King Agathocles, and depiction of the god Zeus. When we look at this one in the middle, this is what is known as a bronze Karshapana. This is a type of coin that is standardized in the Punjab at this time. And we have here 2 separate inscriptions, one in Greek, Basileos Agathokleos, much like this one over in the left, but also this one written in Brahmi as well, Rajane Agathokouliasasa, King Agathocles. And this these coin types of Agathocles actually help translate some of these older languages because they provide that counterpoint of the Greek as kind of like the Rosetta Stone. Now, also, as we see on the right here, this is the first known depiction of the Hindu deity Vasudeva Krishna, which will play a role in the next slide. Near the city of Vidisha in Madhya Pradesh, known as Besnagar of antiquity, there stands a stone pillar dating to around 110 BC. Upon it is an inscription written in Prakrit Indian, which reads as follows, quote, "This Garuda pillar of Vasudeva, the god of gods, was constructed here by Heliodora, the Bhagavata, son of Dia of Takshashila. the Greek ambassador who came from the great king Amaltalikita to King Kashiputra Bhagabhadra, the savior, prospering in his 14th regnal year. These 3 steps to immortality, when correctly followed, lead to heaven: control, generosity, and attention. As we can As we can read from the text, this was established on the authority of Antiochus I, who ruled in Takshila in the northern Punjab. He was likely attempting to court the alliance with a local ruler in India for reasons unknown. And while this is certainly an interesting chronological marker, for Antiochus is not mentioned in any other sources beyond the inscription and his coins, for our purposes, it's more important for its dedicant. This would be Heliodora or Heliodoros. Heliodoros is the Greek version of the name. Heliodoros describes himself as a Iona Dutena, which is Greek ambassador. This is giving himself an ethnic Greek identity, but he's communicating in this with a very strong grasp of an Indian language. What is striking about this inscription is that he also describes himself as a Bhagavata, an extremely specific term referring to a devotee of the god Vasudeva Krishna, the same deity that was on the coin of Agathocles. The second part of this text also here, these 3 steps, immortality, when correctly followed, lead to heaven, control, generosity, and attention, is actually a verse from the Mahabharata, one of the most important epic poems to ever be written and a foundational text of Hinduism. Heliodoros must have been deeply versed in early Hindu thought, providing us a clear-cut example of an ethnic Greek adhering to the religious customs of India. Traditionally, Greek kings were very prone to supporting local cults and religions, like the Seleucids were supporting Babylonian gods and the Ptolemies of Egyptian gods. But right now, we actually see a specific reference to a devotee of a Hindu deity, probably one of the first foreign converts referring to any sort of deity in this case. Now, this is not to say that there was no sense of Hellenization in the Greek territory, or India, rather. We've been talking mostly about Indianization of Greeks moving into the subcontinent. Now, there is a difference here where you have the Hellenization of the Indian subjects. On the left here, we have what is called the Sophitos inscription. This was found outside of Old Kandahar, Alexandria, Arachosia, and discovered in the early 2000s. This was a funerary marker from a man known as Sophitos, which is likely a Greek translation of the name Subhuti, his father of Narada. This text is very fascinating. First off, it's an acrostic, meaning that the first letters of each row equal another sentence, Sophitos of Naratos. Now, the text reads as such, or at least the beginning parts of it, quote, "But I, Sophitos, son of Naratos, pitiably bereft while quite small of my ancestral livelihood, after I had acquired the virtue of the archer and the muses." Sophitos was a merchant from the region and was eager to express his learned background as part of his self-made image from rags to riches. In it, he cites Greek literature and mythology, such as allusions to Homer's Odyssey, and the more contemporary works like the poetry of Callimachus of Alexandria. We can clearly see he's trying to brag about his education, but whether he wanted to see how Hellenized he was, or how Greek cultural adherent he is, it's not too clear. But it does indicate that Greek intellectual culture was at least present or flourishing in Central Asia and India at the time. The transmission of Greek stories and motifs are apparent with the Buddhist art of Gandhara on the left. Gandhara referring to parts of the northern Punjab and the Swat Valley. Mythological figures like the demigod Heracles and satyrs. Heracles right here wielding a club, and also the thunderbolt, the Vajra. This make an appearance in Buddhist art alongside of the Buddha in his first human anthropomorphized form. These take place a few centuries after Indo-Greek rule, but clearly the transmission of Greek mythology is occurring, albeit in a Buddhist context. Now, the Greek orator of the first century, second century AD, Dio Chrysostom, claims that, quote, "It is said that Homer's poetry is sung even in India, where they have translated it into their own speech and tongue." When we see the relief here from Gandhara, we can clearly see what happens to be a scene from the Trojan cycle. As figures pulled in a wheeled horse, while a possibly wailing Cassandra vainly attempts to warn them of their plight. The Indian artists and patrons who must have funded these works presumably had a deep understanding of Greek literature, or at least the cultural memory of the Greeks, but were able to reinterpret them to fit their own particular affinities or preconceptions. Now, this marks the end of the intensity of Greco-Indian contact. From that point, the Indo-Greeks had fallen by the 1st century AD. The early first century, first decade or so, and there was a cultural legacy, but eventually was faded out as we approach late antiquity. But despite the overall lack of evidence, the snapshots of interactions between the ancient Greeks and Indians during the Hellenistic period are incredibly fascinating. In a period in less than 300 years, we see the stages of understanding as they go from the fantastical or mythological to more grounded with Megasthenes, and eventually you see an exchange of ideas. We also saw how cultural transmission is not a one-way street, as both groups were able to borrow or adapt each other's traditions to fit their own ends and purposes, and create something spectacular and new, such as the Buddhist art of Kandahar. I hope I've been able to illuminate probably what I consider one of the most fascinating periods of the ancient world, just one small portion of what I talk about. And I hope you're able to join me on my show to discover the rest of these interactions and see how exactly do peoples who are unfamiliar with each other come to terms through conflict or coexistence. And I've also included here a list of further reading to go off of if you are interested in the subject. So I definitely recommend checking these books out first, foremost and of all else.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So if folks have questions, if you want to put them in the chat or raise your hand, I can try and unmute you. And I guess while we wait for some questions, so Derek, maybe you could, I'm interested in this sort of like, there's a bunch of people doing really interesting podcasts. So what sort of got you into like doing this subject in the first place?
It was actually a topic I knew very little about, which is funny enough. I actually was a big fan of ancient Greece and Rome as a child, never really knew much about the Hellenistic period, since most schooling you go to maybe Alexander and then you skip to the Roman Republic and Caesar and whatnot. And I only been aware of the Seleucids and Antigonids from a very vague references in the Roman wars of the Greek East. So I thought to tackle this topic as kind of a challenge to myself to learn more. And I eventually was fascinated, especially with the cultures that were in Asia and Central Asia and India, like the Bactrians, like the Indo-Greeks, like the Seleucids. And for me, this has kind of been an interesting project because I've been learning as I go on. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody raising their hand.
Oh, am I on?
Yep, you're on. Go ahead.
Hi, Trevor. I'm actually a long-time listener. Yeah, so really glad you're doing this. But yeah, I had a question about, especially in regards to religion and like the Greeks that came to India were at this time, Plato had been around, and Plato and Pythagoras had been around for quite a long time. So were they kind of I guess amused or intrigued that some of the ideas of reincarnation and like the complex ideas of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy sort of are mirrored in some of those Greek thinkers? Is there any indication that they noticed this, or like they and what do they think of like the ideas that perhaps were perhaps not so familiar, like Shakyamuni, the Buddha, represents a sort of like a very Indian form of spirituality, but like that was not so common in the Mediterranean world, perhaps. But anyway, is there any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. To kind of tackle the first part, unfortunately, we don't really have any testimony of Indian and Buddhist, or I guess like generically a Buddhist or even Hindu thought by the Greco-Roman sources. The only possible close example is from the philosopher Pyrrho of Elis. Many comparisons have been drawn between his philosophy, which is Pyrrhonian skepticism, and the strong parallels it has with Buddhism. That's a kind of a complex topic, but there have been many parallels drawn by modern scholars suggesting there is a brief reference in the text in the biography of Diogenes Laertius suggesting that Pyrrho, who was accompanied Alexander the Great to India, had spoken to what he called the gymnosophists. These are referring to the naked philosophers, literally translated gymnosophist, naked philosopher. We don't really know if these teachers were Buddhist. These could have been, they're more reminiscent of Hindu, like sages or ascetics known as sadhus. Whether they actually, there's a lot of parallels in it, such as their form of argumentation, like the tetralemma, for example, the concept of the, of finding tranquility or ataraxia, as it's known in the Greeks. But we just don't have enough evidence to suggest that this couldn't have been a convergent ideal philosophy. They speak of the idea of the axial age and whatnot, but we don't, but kind of getting more into that, we do have an idea that the Greeks were patronizing Buddhism in the Indo-Greek period. Now, I didn't mention this in the article or the PowerPoint because it would have been too long, because I can go on and on and on, but we have at least one Indo-Greek king in Indian sources who allegedly converted to Buddhism. This would be Menander, or at least possibly Menander the First Soter, who appears in a Pali Indian text known as the Milinda Panya, or the Questions of King Milinda. And there's been endless speculation as to what that origin relates to, but we do know that Menander must have at least patronized Buddhist philosophy along with other Indo-Greek rulers, like what they did with the Vasudeva Krishna and other Hindian deities. But to kind of get to your second point, and I apologize if I've forgotten, but were you referring to specifically?
Yes, I was referring to, like, did the Greeks actually understood what Buddhism is, or they just thought of it as another spiritual cult, or did they really know that the Buddhism was an offshoot of this vast ideas of Hinduism, the notions of dharma and karma and samsara? Is there any indication that is there any indication that King Menander the First actually understood what he was doing when he converted to Buddhism? Did he have any idea? Did he thought that he was gonna escape samsara or anything like that? Or
I really wish we could answer that. Unfortunately, the Indo-Greek period is so fragmented.
Oh, yeah.
We can draw big conclusions, but there are some interesting points to bring up. One, the example of Gandharan art, like that, the appearance of the Shakyamuni Buddha. They have recently discovered that they've discovered sculptures in Alexandria in Egypt that show the Buddha. So clearly there are Buddhist practice, either there are Buddhists practicing or there are craftsmen working in the area who are familiar with the image by the 1st or 2nd century AD. There is a brief reference in one of the literary texts. I believe it's, I have the text cited in another source I'm working on, but he does speak about the Buddha, or Bodo, he calls him, in the 3rd century AD, early 3rd century AD. So the idea of Buddhism is making its way into the Western world, or the Mediterranean world. Menander, whether he actually understood what he was doing, maybe. According to the Pali text, he is acting as an interlocutor, asking the Buddhist sage Nagasena a series of questions to try to be like, all right, generate thought. What about morality? What is peace? Trying to generate conversation, but he's more of a mouthpiece or vehicle to get the story to allow Nagasena to communicate his Buddhist philosophy. But there is a brief reference in Plutarch, which suggests that Menander was buried in a similar fashion to that of the Buddha, where his ashes are divided amongst the various cities of Central Asia and India. But that's a whole nother story entirely. But it's very interesting to see these little nuggets come right through. We just don't have anything concrete to attach. We only have Ashoka's mention of Buddhism. And like I said, there was no reference to any envoys of Buddhism coming into the Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic period. But we do know that there was something going on. We just don't know how much, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'll.
Oops. Sorry. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off there. But thanks for the question. We have a couple more questions in the chat. So we have Trevor asks, you showed Kasharpana from Antiochus. Did the Hellenistic kingdoms mint their own Indian style coins in addition to the Greek standards?
Yes. So the Hindu Kush is often described as some sort of like economic barrier to the north. In Bactria, they are adhering to the Attic standard, which was established in Athens for where we get the name Attic. But in India, in the southern parts of Punjab, we start seeing square coin types. This was minted at the same time as this was minted, but it's square, it's a little smaller, which the Indian standard, I believe, is about 1.3 grams smaller per average on the coin types. And we also see the prevalence of more Indian imagery. However, let me also pull up the other example here. The coin of Antiochus I. The front of it is very Bactrian or very Indo-Greek. We see him, wielding a spear, the diadem, Basileus Antiochidou, Basileus Antiochidou, excuse me if I'm butchering the Greek. And then on the back here, we have it in Karashthi. And we also appear what to have here. We have an elephant and Zeus, but it's likely fusing the two into creating some sort of representation that's implied to be Indra, Lord of Elephants. And we see here that there's this blend going on, what appears to be a Greek coin type with still a large amount of Indian elements on them. So yes, we are seeing both and kind of a mixture of both influences. It's clear that there was this, the Hindu Kush is some sort of dividing line between the two. And it's incredibly interesting to see how economically they change once they get to the Punjab.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Preston. With the reference to the 5 kings, is there evidence of any substantial trade with the Ptolemaic kingdom through the Red Sea and Egypt? They seem like natural allies against the Seleucids.
So, if anything, the unfortunately the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade. I'm actually gonna, maybe I have a map here I can draw. Actually, I don't. The trade with India was actually pretty minuscule for much of the Hellenistic period, and I'm referring to specifically the trade coming through the Red Sea. About the beginning of the 1st century BC, we have a story, late 2nd century, early century BC. The Greeks didn't know how to sail really to India that easily. They had more of a series of intermediaries for the most part. There's a story, referring to an Indian sailor that had washed up and was rescued by the Ptolemaic navy around the time of Ptolemy VIII Physcon, I believe. He eventually learned Greek and was able to tell them about the monsoon winds. The Greeks had very little understanding of the monsoon, how they worked. This is what led to a near catastrophe in the Alexandrian campaign, where the naval officer of Alexander, Nearchus, had nearly been lost in the process. And they eventually got to India. By this point, though, it was already, the Mauryan Empire had collapsed. There was brief references to diplomats being sent between Egypt and India, but nothing like you would see with the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC and AD, when you really have the crossing back and forth of merchant vessels looking for spices and for silks. That would be the apogee of Mediterranean Indian contact for much of the world's history up to this point. So unfortunately, no, we just don't know much about it. And actually, the Seleucids had a monopoly on Indian elephants, which were considered superior to that of the North African variety, which the Ptolemies had to go down the Red Sea along the coast of East Africa as far as the Sudan, and even maybe as far as not Cameroon, excuse me, as the Sudan and Somalia. Those are about the extent. So you're getting really close to the edge where the Red Sea is then moving into the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. So unfortunately, we can't say that there was much trade between the two.
Great, thanks so much. Are there other questions? We have about 3 more minutes. If there's a quick question, we might be able to get it in there. Not seeing any. Well, yeah, Derek, I don't know if you have any sort of closing remarks or want to send us off.
Sure. So, I mean, again, thank you all for tuning in. This has been a first-time presentation in quite a few years, so this was a very fun to do compared to my normal process. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, or you want to learn more about this particular topic, my podcast is going through this subject right now as we speak. But I also will be able to share with you a list of sources to go to if you have any questions relating to Greek and Hellenistic world. These are the big ones I usually recommend for this, but definitely, feel free to reach out to me anytime by searching up Hellenistic Age podcast.
Great, thanks so much. And feel free to continue the conversation. I think there's a main lobby and you can feel free to do that there. Great. Thank you,
Sure.
Derek. Thank you. Everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.